I do wear quite a few hats. I do run an OSPO. Before that, I spent 15 years at Red Hat, mostly in the OSPO there. I'm also a member of the Open Source Initiative Board of Directors and as Rachel mentioned, president of the Apache Software Foundation, or the ASF, which I know sounds like I have more than one full-time job, but a lot of folks don't realize the ASF is still nearly entirely volunteer run, and that includes the officers and the board. So that is the reason that I list those things, because I do hate when people spend all of a talk introducing themselves, is that that's a lot of several long established organizations in open source software. So open source under that name and the ASF as well are closing in on 30 years old, which means we've lived through a lot of technology waves, from the early web stuff to cloud to AI now, all the spots in between. And specific technologies, though, are mostly like clouds, but more like real clouds. So, and I say that because they come and they go, they blow in, they blow out. What lasts is not those specific technologies, but the structures that help people build them together. And remembering that is what's going to propel us through the next 30 years and beyond. At which point, I hope very much to not still be talking about this personally, but to have been a piece of this successful ecosystem that continues to be as critical, or even perhaps more so, to the world as open source is today. So I also have to admit that I'm going to go a bit off the rails from the advertised title of this talk. Security is still a part of it, but the overarching theme of this event is open source in 2026. And looking at 2026 and beyond, I'm actually thinking about three things, both for the ASF and for the entire open source ecosystem, because none of us are doing this alone. We're all pieces of that ecosystem. And those three things are security, which, as promised, but also sustainability and stewardship, because they're not three separate things. I think of them as three legs holding up the same chair, making sure that the open source ecosystem they're holding up doesn't just survive, but continues to thrive. So I didn't feel like I could get very far into security without talking about the other two pieces, but I will definitely start there. And that's because over the last few years, there have been some high profile security vulnerabilities that have repeatedly demonstrated to the world at large that software is never entirely secure. This is not a huge revelation, I'm sure, to anyone listening. What was seemingly a new piece of information to a lot of people was that so much of the important software in the world is open source. And thus, a lot of them who hadn't been around in all those years assumed that the problem was caused by open source being somehow less secure. And we know, and we have the data to show that that's not accurate. And we can explain in each one of those cases, whatever someone might be concerned about, why the openness of the software in question was not the problem. So, for example, Log4Shell was truly a vulnerability, not malicious code. And that's a distinction that matters. More recently, the exeutils backdoor, it was possible in the way that it was created because the software was open source. However, a similar malicious actor certainly could have, and probably has, I try not to think about that too hard, done the same thing by gaining trust as an employee of a company, creating that malicious code in proprietary software. The important difference is that because XZ was open, we were able to see it and discover it and intervene. And that actually happened before it became a significant problem. We likely couldn't say the same if it were not open. So, because of open source's prevalence in the global software ecosystem, not anything specifically wrong with open source, these incidents, as they continue to happen, moved open source security from being this sort of niche concern of the security folks to being truly a geopolitical and regulatory priority. And we already heard some of this from Katie. So, it's okay to think for a moment about what a big change that is. So, open source went from the perception of being this thing that hobbyists did to eventually being described in the occasional tech article as maybe a potentially viable competitor, to being so critical that it's the subject of significant regulatory concern around the world. And we've got people like Katie thinking about it as their entire jobs. And that all happened in about 25 years, give or take how you do the math. So now, again, because of its success, because you don't bother attacking things that nobody uses, we've got these security incidents happening, and they really highlight that the most significant risk lies not in new or even complex necessarily applications, but in these ubiquitous foundational utilities that are often maintained by a handful of volunteers, or worst case, one, maybe two. And then that brings attention to who those volunteers are, who uses their code, how this whole system works that has largely become indispensable without much notice. And that's how we got to this part where the last couple of years, governments have begun to step in with regulation. So in the UK, there was the PSTI Act, and Katie talked a lot about the executive orders and other movement in the US. And then, of course, EU has the Cyber Resilience Act, or the CRA. And the CRA is the one really top of mind for a lot of the industry right now. The December 2027 date when it goes into full effect still sounds really far away. It sounds far away, but it's not. But security reporting obligations go into effect, check your calendar, 8 months minus 2 days from right now, 8 months. Complying with all this still feels like a really gargantuan task, even to large software producing corporations, much less independent software developers. The recognition in the CRA of open source stewards being spelled out, that carve out is going to help us all a lot. And working together as an open source ecosystem instead of as individual companies and projects and foundations is going to continue to be vitally important. If figuring all this out is important to you and you haven't yet found the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group yet, I highly recommend visiting the website. It's orcwg.org. If someone who is not talking could type that in chat for folks, that would be helpful. orcwg.org. And then if you happen to be in Brussels in a couple of weeks for all of the open source week activities, there's a ton going on there. The ORC community will have a code and compliance event. There's a whole CRA and practice dev room, policy summit. I'll be speaking at a lot of these. And if you're not, these sorts of events are going on around the world all the time. Really, this is a hot topic of conversation. And one of the things I'm most interested in discussing at all these events is the fact that we're going to have to see some new ways of looking at investment in the ecosystem to address all of those changing requirements. And Patrick talked a little bit about that, and I'll get back to it in a bit. Back at the ASF, one of the biggest changes in 2025 for us, and very important for several reasons, was the launch of our tooling initiative. It's the first of a new program called ASF Initiatives, and there will be more of those, but this particular one aims to streamline development and continue improving our already strong security posture, but there's always more you can do, right? So the tooling initiative's core project is called Apache Trusted Releases, or ATR, and that is a secure distribution platform for releases. It has a web app that handles the full release process. Projects can upload their artifacts from an assortment of methods because, as Rachel mentioned, the ASF has hundreds of projects, and we don't mandate every detail of how they work. So that's why there are a lot of options there for whatever's appropriate for each community. ATR also has additional features for projects with reproducible builds. It's got assorted policy and standards checks, SBOM verification, for example. It has been through a public alpha and is heading into a production ready beta with even more on the horizon this year, like Salsa and attestation checks. So I am really excited about what this will do for our projects and communities and ultimately for their users. Really excited about watching that grow this year. Because the world has figured out that open source software is not just here, but actually, in fact, utterly critical to modern life. So I want to build a metaphor for you. The open source ecosystem is a garden that ultimately produces the crops that become all the critical software and networks and tools and the internet itself, really. It is a community garden where we can all come together to plant the things we collectively need, and we tend to them together because it's wasting resources to each build our own gardens. But this little garden that we started almost 30 years ago has really turned into more of a massive farm at this point, and we need to keep our crops safe in a variety of ways. So those regulators are starting to build fences around the garden. And we're all learning to use the fiddly latch on the gate. And they're telling us who's going to be responsible if someone gets ergot poisoning from our grain field, to really stretch this metaphor. Those of you who may have heard me talk about the history of intellectual property law before have also heard me talk about how early trademark law in the 1600s was a very similar situation to this, but for bakers. You were legally required with really stiff penalties to put your personal mark on your bread, which was effectively a signed attestation of your bread, so that when it was found to be of inferior quality or somebody got sick, they knew who had created it and could probably even trace the grain back to where it came from to hold those folks responsible. I promise I do sometimes think about metaphors that don't have anything to do with grain or bread. Today is not that day. So I'm going to keep leaning on this garden metaphor. And that brings us to the second piece of those three, which is sustainability. And again, these are not separate issues, they're quite intertwined. A lot of people hear sustainability as a polite euphemism for give me money. And I've spent a lot of time in conference talks and panels and interviews now insisting that it's so much more than that. It's more than money, and it is. So I'm not contradicting myself. However, right now, I do want to talk about the money part for a moment. Patrick talked a lot about it, so I want to highlight it as well. All of that regulatory compliance and increased focus on security isn't going to come for free, and probably not cheaply either. To meet these demands coming at us, the SBOMs, release attestations, even formal risk-based triage, all of those steps require a lot, dedicated infrastructure and tools and expertise. And that means we're finding that the old model of expecting volunteers who may or may not be paid by their employers to do the work to take care of everything just isn't going to keep working forever. So, in this metaphorical community garden, we need those people who are benefiting from the harvest on the other end to buy seeds and fertilizer and spend some time weeding and to pay a gardener to do it for them when they're not able to. And it would be really great if, as this gets bigger, if maybe we could get an irrigation system in here to relieve the burden on those gardeners doing it all by hand. And if those who want the harvest at the end can't help with any of that, then we have to find a way to explain that the garden can't keep feeding them because it will fall apart. So yeah, the ecosystem needs funding. For all these years, we have looked to the corporate consumers of open source to support it with financial contributions and sometimes hiring contributors to do the work, largely through let's say fairly soft motivation. Why companies contribute to projects and foundations varies both by company and the thing they're supporting, but across the board, we're hearing that the old ways just aren't enough anymore. And as the world continues to change in the next few years or 8 months minus 2 days, the gap between what the open source ecosystem has and what it needs is going to continue to widen. So we can grow increasingly vast fields of metaphorical wheat together, much larger than any of us could have built alone, which means we can grow more together than we each could have grown alone. And when it comes time for the harvest, I can make flour and you can create biofuels and somebody else can use it to make starch for industrial purposes because wheat is pretty magical like that. But we've reached a time where a lot of corporate consumers are happy to drive by the field once a month, make sure things are still growing, and then not show up until it's time to collect the harvest. Which also means that to some extent, we failed in an important job as the ones who built the garden because those corporate consumers are part of our community too. And we failed to adequately explain to them that open source truly is an ecosystem. And just like an actual ecological system, those being the words that form the ecosystem portmanteau, just like an ecology, if they're not putting back in, there will be nothing left to take out. And so, probably because it's a lot of the work that I've done for a long time and because I've seen them be successful at a lot of companies, I think a good bit of that work to help those corporate consumers understand this can be done by open source program offices, acknowledging that first they have to have one of those. But those are the groups that act as the advocates for upstream first in those companies. And upstream first isn't just a delightful philosophy, but it can be and should be a productive and useful part of the company's business model. Because industry has come to rely on open source without recognizing the work that its ongoing health requires. If we don't change that, there will be increasingly serious problems as projects collapse under the pressure. So, by way of example, touching back on the exautils incident, the reason a bad actor was able to gain the trust of the original maintainers was simply because they offered to help. By offering to help on a heavily used and under resourced project, it is hardly the only project in such a situation. And increasing participation from those who benefit from the results is the solution. And by the way, important side note, showing up for whoever might need to hear this or send this to someone else to hear. Showing up on a project's doorstep demanding that they build the features you want or support your use for free is not actually participation. So, I started the sustainability part by saying we need money. Money is important, but money isn't community. Having more contribution, and there are many kinds of contribution, having more contribution in a project reduces the strain probably at least as much as money and builds a community with a shared mission. It is so easy to underestimate the importance of the community building piece, especially for those figuring out how all this even works for the folks who are still new to the whole open source concept beyond, oh, look, free software. Because what they're there for, they're here for the code, right? You just want the software. And that's exactly the outlook that leads to the problem. Just hand me the code. But at the ASF, our motto is community over code. And that's for a very good reason, because I like to say a strong and healthy community comes first because community can fix bad code, but good code can't fix a bad community. And that means that the next important step is for some of the gardeners to contribute by teaching gardening so that new gardens can thrive. And that gets me to the last piece, which is stewardship. I think this is a piece where the ASF shines and can help other projects and foundations by setting an example of a full cradle to grave life cycle for projects, or more accurately, in our terms, it would be incubator to attic. It's important to look at community health from end to end. And so the incubator is where new projects or podlings, we call them, begin. It's where they learn the Apache way. That includes that leadership is earned, not bought. No single company should hold the keys to a project. A lot of things about working together as a community. At the other end of the life cycle, we have the attic, which is where a project goes when it's time for retirement. Because by being honest about what no longer needs to be maintained, we get to protect users and free up contributors to work on something new. I am sure that you can think of situations you've been in, either in a company or even your project communities, where something had had a good life, but the organization didn't have a structure to give it a good ending. And that's what the attic is a way to give projects a good ending. So, what I'd like to see us work on more in 2026, not just at the ASF, but around the ecosystem, is a piece in the middle of that life cycle that I think many, if not most, open source projects could benefit from. And that is better onboarding of new contributors. Because coming into open source projects 15 and 20 and 25 years ago and more at this point was very different. The software is much more complex today, and jumping in is intimidating. Not only is the software itself more complex, but over time, communities have fallen into, we can call them habits, routines. Don't get me wrong, social norms are an important part of communities. Those repeated patterns make things easier, smoother. They build cohesiveness and bonding. However, even when they're ultimately good habits, there's still something that have to be learned by newcomers, sometimes effectively acting like a shibboleth. And that is just one more hurdle to participation, to getting those new people inside. And then, of course, sometimes there's bad habits, or sometimes it's just comfort and inertia, all of which can easily look like attempts to actively prevent newcomers from joining in. Recruiting is hard work, so don't waste the time it took to find those new contributors by making their experience so terrible they leave and then you have to start over and do all that work over again. We all need to be doing a better job becoming better role models for the next generation of contributors and helping them build whatever the next level of success for open source looks like. Stewarding processes, teaching the Apache way, this is a great step in the right direction. But the goal here isn't just taking care of the software or tending the garden. It ultimately has to also be about taking care of the gardeners themselves and the health of their communities that keep the gardens alive, making sure that they're teaching their skills to new folks and taking care of one another because life happens to all of us. We are still humans. So, to lean on my metaphor one last time, I swear, I want to tell you about a real botanical garden, the botanical garden at the University of Padua. It was created by an architect who learned from other gardens and built this one to teach others. And so then a few years later, as it grew, it was enclosed with a wall for security. And then a little bit after that, they added irrigation systems to improve growth. And they added attractive gates into the fences and better decor. And you can't meet anyone who did that because they built this garden in 1545. And then they taught others what they knew, and it's been teaching and preserving and making important contributions, not just to botany, but chemistry and medicines and other fields continuously ever since then. And that's what we should do. That's why keeping all three of these goals tied together is so important. Security and sustainability and stewardship go together, and they're how we get the harvest that continues to feed everyone every year. And beyond that, to be able to make new innovations, not just in software, but in all of the fields that they touch. So that is what I am excited to think about in 2026, and please feel free to reach out. If you can spell my last name, you can find me pretty much where anywhere on the internet. I'll type it in the chat in case you missed it at the beginning.